Many, many years ago, there was an announcer who went on the air, and all he did was mutter the words, "This is jazz," on the Voice of America. That was followed by Duke Ellington's "Take the A Train." Now, there's many of you right now who probably know who I'm talking about, and that is the legendary Voice of America broadcaster Willis Conover, who continued doing that show until the mid 1990s when he passed away in the month of May around 1996. Well, the jazz tradition has continued on the VOA. The show now is called Jazz America. And joining us at his home studio, if I can say that, all the way in New York City, is Russ Davis. Hello, Russ.
Hello, Keith, and yes, you're correct. This is my home studio office, and I love working in my own space here. And if this were video, you'd see 7,000 CDs on a wall behind me. I still use a lot of CDs, and I love being surrounded by all of these things and having my own little studio. It's a new world, my friend. You and I have done broadcasting for a few years, and we now have to be our own engineers as well as our own presenters and programmers. So it's a great situation to be in. I really enjoy working in my own space here. But be aware that there's some construction going on next door. We may hear some rumbling.
Well, it's kind of amazing when you think about it because Willis Conover presented the jazz show on the VOA for many years, and for all that time, he was in a studio in Washington with a technician, a production assistant, probably a whole group of other people as well. And today, we can do radio in the most simple of environments.
No doubt about it. In fact, I work with Voice of America as an independent contractor, as Willis did as well. He had a different situation. I'll tell you a funny story about that. But in addition to that, I do other programs for other people from time to time. I've done programs for Jazz FM in England and for Bay FM 78 in the Tokyo Bay Area and for other stations around the world. And also, I have my own online radio channel called Moja Radio, MOJA, mojaradio.com for modern jazz. And so all of those things come from this one little spot, and I'm the only person involved in doing it. Now, with Willis, he had a very interesting situation. He did his program for over 40 years, and he did it from that studio in Washington, D.C., in the VOA offices. Well, he was not an employee of the U.S. government. He was an independent contractor, but he was so powerful that he commandeered a studio space and got all of these people to help him and do his work with him. And one day an auditor walked in and said, "Who is this guy? He's not on our list." Somehow he was basically breaking the law by having that office, but he was such an influential and powerful figure that they just kind of overlooked the rules and let Willis go as he would. And that's the power of jazz, my friend.
Well, it certainly is. Now, when you started doing Jazz America, because of the history of jazz on the VOA and Willis Conover, was it going through the back of your mind, did you ever think, how am I going to fill those shoes? How am I going to fill that void?
Keith, you better believe I thought about that because as being a jazz radio presenter and programmer since 1978, and everyone in the industry knew Willis's name. Now, people inside the United States of America did not, because at that point there was no internet broadcasting. It was only terrestrial broadcasting. So by law and the charter of the VOA, it was illegal for people to broadcast VOA reproduce them inside the USA. So nobody knew him, but we in the industry knew him. So I knew what a legendary figure he was. And when I heard that they had run out of playing his old programs and they were looking for a new presenter, a friend of mine who worked in Washington, D.C. and had a friend at VOA said, "Well, you should apply for this." And I said, "Well, I know Willis Conover, and I knew he was a 100% straight ahead, in other words, very traditional jazz programmer and presenter. And I was involved and aware of and conversant with not only straight ahead traditional jazz, but I also leaned a lot in the work that I had done with contemporary jazz or modern jazz and even electric jazz, something I think that Willis would have turned his back on. And I didn't think they really wanted someone like me. So when I said, well, why not? You know, I have some international experience and I work in New York and I've worked in different markets. So why not? I'll just give it a shot. I discovered that John Stevenson, one of the heads of English broadcasting, who was in charge of bringing on board a new jazz presenter, he was interested in someone who had that awareness and would modernize the style of jazz on VOA. And so, because of that and my international experience, they brought me in. But it was a daunting task because I knew that a lot of people who'd listened to Willis over the years were probably going to be expecting that purely traditional presentation, and that wasn't something I was going to present. So I was not sure I was going to be accepted, but luckily over the years now, and I've been doing this since 1999, I've had broad acceptance from both factions of the jazz fandom, if you will, those who will accept modern and even embrace modern jazz, and those who are traditionalists.
When you started the show, did you start the show in New York, or were you just going back and forth between Washington?
No, I've always done it from New York. But at the time, I was also working with a satellite radio company based in Washington, D.C., so I was back and forth quite often between the two. But I always produced it, and that was part of the agreement. They did not want to have another situation where someone was going to be coming in using their facilities and their studio. So it was mandated that I had to have my own studio, and that was fine with me. I already had it in place. And Washington and New York City is where I produced the program 100% of the time.
This past weekend, when I was tuning in, because Jazz Americas is heard here in Asia on medium wave, shortwave, and you can also pick it up on the internet. And the VOA being a powerhouse, what it is, the shortwave frequencies for the VOA are booming here. I mean, literally booming, and that's an understatement.
That's
And
great.
it was an interesting show because you were talking about the mixture of jazz and classical music.
Yes.
And that is something that your approach to Jazz America being so different. As much as I respect Willis Conover and I listened to his show for many years, your show really covers a broader spectrum of jazz, because if you say jazz, you can't really narrow it into just one specific type, because there's so many types.
Yes, sir. You know that's right, Keith. And here's part of the reason for that. Willis was covering basically the big band era and the great singers, and he loved them deeply in the standards and how those standards pop songs of the day had been turned into jazz pieces. And those great big bands, I mean, come on, Duke Ellington, Take the A Train was his theme song, and all those wonderful singers, Sarah Vaughan, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, etc. He started basically in that area, Louis Armstrong and the first recordings of the 30s basically, and he went up to bebop and a little bit beyond. Okay, so we're talking about a spectrum of, in general, generally speaking, about 4 decades. For me, I'll play Louis Armstrong, I'll play Billie Holiday, I'll play Bessie Smith if I can find anything. I'll play the first recordings of jazz, but right next to it, I'll play something from 2010. So I'm talking about 80 years that I'm covering, because jazz, like any other art form, has gone through an evolution and continues to evolve. So many jazz purists and you laughed when I said this in the beginning, that I would actually have the audacity to play electric jazz. Many jazz purists don't believe that jazz can be made with electric instruments. Well, au contraire, mon frère, it can, because to me, part of the definition of jazz is that it is improvised music. And if it is improvised, then it can be played on an oud, it can be played on a harp, it can be played on an electric guitar, it can be played on an electric keyboard, just like it can be played on a saxophone, a trumpet, a clarinet, an acoustic piano, or any other acoustic instrument. So the fact that that is true, and that it is a wonderful American born art form of international elements. But now the international jazz and improvised music scene is so alive, and we have the ability to share our different styles with one another from all over the world. Well, it's one of the most exciting times in jazz history. So, why in the world would I limit the scope of what I would be playing? I have so much to choose from, not only the 8 decades, but also the many styles from literally all over the world.
Between 2000 and 2006, I hosted a jazz show that was airing on domestic radio in China called Jazz Beat. And when I started the show, because it was mainly targeting a Chinese audience, and at the time when I started the show, there were no other jazz shows airing in China. I presented it in English. And I remember thinking, okay, the audience is probably going to want to hear the Billie Holidays and the Louis Armstrongs. And I remember one week bringing along Chick Corea, who I absolutely adore his stuff. I think his stuff is absolutely fabulous. And even the stuff that he was doing in the 70s was, at the time, I found, way ahead of its time. And I remember playing the track, it was from a classic album that he recorded on ECM. And I was so surprised at the response, because people wrote me and they said, they said the stuff that I heard, I would never have put it into the jazz category.
Uh-huh. I'd like to know what that song was.
I think it was Return to Yesterday.
Uh-huh. Return to Forever.
Return to Forever, that's it, yes.
Right, exactly. Well, I think that there are so many different styles that run through the mind and soul and spirit of Chick Corea, and he's a great example of openness and eagerness to embrace any influence that he comes in contact with. He would never limit himself, and that to me is the essence of jazz. So many times when I get email from folks from all over the world, they resonate to the fact that jazz itself is freedom personified, freedom made manifest in the form of sound, emotion truly coming through, and part of the definition is that it is free. Now, Chick Corea, to me, is the preeminent jazz man alive today, because, and he's turning 70 years old next year, by the way, he is of an age and a generation that is embracing the past. He loved Bud Powell deeply, so he knows the traditions of jazz and can play in that idiom without any problem whatsoever. But he was also born in an age when pop music and rock music were permeating the society. And so any artist who's truly reflecting their time on earth is going to be affected by the trends that they come in contact with at that time. So it was absolutely natural for him to embrace electric instruments because that was what was being used. So he can live in all those various worlds, and he's looking for so many other influences. I've said to him a number of times, Chick, I think you were a Spanish person in another life, because he has this Spanish heart. And he has so much influence of Spanish music, Latin music in his music as well. So he's got 4 or 5 distinct influences that you can easily, recognizably find in his music. And one of them is what a lot of people have called third stream, or the blending of classical music and jazz. He's often mentioned many times that Mozart is his favorite composer, and he's so influenced by his music. So that's probably a lot of what you were hearing when you heard that song, Return to Forever, Keith, and any other music that he's made in the past quite often has had that classical leaning.
Have you heard before, and this is something that I've heard from quite a few people. Quite a few people have said, who are not, they don't like the music, have said, oh, jazz is for old people, and it's an old form of music. And I actually, for myself, I have to completely disagree. I've been to so many jazz festivals. The most recent one was actually one in Tokyo, Japan, and found the audience was predominantly under 30 years old.
Yeah. Well, I will go to my grave arguing with people that jazz is not, quote unquote, old folks music. And I think I know why people say that, because quite often when they think about jazz or read about jazz, they're reading the comments of a writer or a critic who is remembering the quote unquote glory days of jazz when the giants walked the earth. John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington, et cetera, et cetera. Well, those people certainly were giants, but they're just not, those writers are not keeping up with the current trends, partly because, well, a few factors, I suppose. So those same critics are the people that are still in power. They're still most widely read in the most influential jazz publications or websites, etc. And they won't give up their place, and they have no reason to give up their place as very important and prominent writers or critics. They have every right to continue to say what they say. But when folks say it's old folks music, they're not looking hard enough, because people like me, and I have a feeling people like you, and many more open presenters, programmers, writers, and critics are reflecting the new things that are happening. That's a big part of what I do on my channel, Moja Radio. To me, it is covering what I call the middle ground between traditional, mostly acoustic, swing and jazz, that old folks music, as you say, and smooth jazz or contemporary jazz, which is more of an easy listening sort of style. In the middle, and that's where jazz fusion and all of the electric forms of jazz, funky jazz, world jazz, acid jazz, techno jazz, all those forms in the middle ground, that's what I'm covering. And that's what a lot of people, I'm afraid, have overlooked. So those young folks that you saw in Tokyo, and the ones that go to that great festival in Jakarta every year, I've heard there's a fantastic festival there, and festivals really all over the world. They're going and they're hearing all of this wonderful new jazz. And I know with your background, Keith, in Europe, you know how they have embraced electric jazz. There's incredible music coming from Scandinavia. The band Jaga Jazzist is fantastic. Esbjörn Svensson group from Sweden, rest his soul, he was fantastic. He played it in an all-acoustic setting, acoustic piano, bass, and drums, but he embraced new rhythms and new styles and new ways of looking at and creating improvised music. He was not playing the music of Bud Powell, swinging on the ones and the threes. He was doing some backbeating. He was coming up with some new rhythms. Those are the sort of things that I'm looking for to project and to exhibit what jazz is today. And believe me, if anybody thinks it's old folks music, they're just not looking closely enough.
You know, not too long ago on the show, I played an artist who, when I mentioned the name, people would not think of her as a jazz singer, a jazz vocalist. And that is Anne Frida Langstrad, who was one of the vocalists in ABBA. And before she joined ABBA in 1970, she was singing traditional jazz in Stockholm. And there's a number of recordings of her that have now been issued on CD. And you listen to that stuff, and then you listen to, say, ABBA, and you can hear her jazz styling in ABBA songs.
Well, that's an interesting thing that you bring up there, because I think a lot of vocalists were, especially female vocalists, it seems to me, though there are a lot of male vocalists too that are in essence carrying on the tradition by learning what those that came before them did, the ground that they broke. But a lot of female vocalists especially, in fact, I just met a young soul singer named Ife here in New York recently, and I said, you know, there's a lot of jazz sensibility, the same thing you just alluded to in the singer from ABBA, Keith. There's a lot of jazz sensibility in your music. And by that, I mean a blues sensibility and a soulfulness and a spiritual sort of presentation that comes from the blues. And of course, blues is the wellspring from which jazz sprang and was born. Blues came first, then came the jazz. So I think quite often that is what happens. And I asked her about that, and I said, now, would you ever consider doing more jazz and bringing in more jazz elements into your soul music presentation? She said, yes, I want to go back and I want to study the masters, Ella and Sarah and Billie Holiday, etc. And I'd like to do some standards. Well, that's how they practice. That's how they learn the craft to a certain extent. And I think that's what the lady from ABBA was doing. She was kind of learning the craft and tapping into that bluesy, jazzy, soulful sensibility from which jazz vocalizing comes.
Let me mention some names, and I'd like to find out from you what would come to mind. If I say John Zorin.
Freedom. I would say John Zorn is a wonderful blending of his Jewish roots and modern jazz. I saw him performing in Montreal at the Montreal Jazz Festival, and it was the Masada Project. He's written 300 songs in this vein of blending his Jewish culture and sensibilities with his modern approach, with a huge band of electric and acoustic instruments and all kinds of devices and laptops, and it was pure freedom. So I guess you wanted a word association there, but I gave you more than you wanted. I'm sorry. I'll try to cut it down to a word association response.
Well, here's another one. Dave Brubeck.
Sophisticated. Even though okay, you want just word association, or you want me to go into?
You can go into it. I want you to.
He's a sophisticated gentleman. He is just one of the great life forces I've ever been in contact with. I had a chance to interview him last year in Detroit when he performed there, and his sons were playing as well, and I had a chance to speak with them. And they also have that gleam in their eye. They are so alive, and they are so happy to be doing what they're doing. Honestly, happy. Some people are just doing it because they have no choice. I'm just making music because that's all I know how to do. These guys were doing it because they loved it. They loved their father. And he sat and spoke with me for 30 minutes. And I'd only met him once before, but we sat down and it was like I was talking to my best old friend. He was so warm and wonderful. And he is just such a gentleman, such an artist. He broke new ground. He took the flack from many purists who didn't think that what he was doing, incorporating world music ideas and different rhythms and a different approach and a lighter approach, if you will, not the hard driving bebop of everybody else. He was coming up with a new style that was totally reflective of himself and his great band, Paul Desmond. And what a gentleman and what a sophisticated style of music Dave Brubeck has created. And happy birthday to him on December the 6th. He's 90 years old and still going strong.
Well, let's go back a little further now. Fletcher Henderson.
Fletcher Henderson is one of those band leaders who I don't know a lot about him as a person. I can't quote chapter and verse on his entire life. I'm not even sure where he's from, but and that quite often does have an important factor, is an important factor in the kind of music you make. If you're from the southern United States, you could maybe be more of a bluesy or New Orleans traditional style player, and if you're from Chicago or Detroit or New York, you're probably going to be a little bit more hard-edged and more into a bebop sort of sensibility. But he was a big band guy, and he, of course, was the person who helped bring a lot of great players and a lot of great singers to prominence, and just a terrific band leader, and from all accounts, a real character. I can't say much more than that.
You know, it amazes me sometimes when, let's say, you have 20th century composers that really changed a lot in music. Let's say like John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Way back in the late 1960s, Count Basie recorded an album for Verve called Basie's Beetle Bag, where he's doing jazz arrangements of very popular songs by Lennon and McCartney. And it's amazing in some ways, when I listen to it now, it's almost as if Lennon and McCartney, when they wrote those songs, they had the idea of jazz arrangements in mind. I mean, even Ella Fitzgerald did a swing version of "Can't Buy My Love."
Oh yeah, and George Benson did the other side of Abbey Road, and I think that he caught a lot of flack for that too. But after folks like Ella Fitzgerald and Count Basie had created those works, I think it should have been no question involved here. It should have been just fine. I think that we probably, as far as Lennon and McCartney are concerned, I think we probably have to attribute a little bit of the sophistication of those songs and the way they were originally recorded and presented and arranged to George Martin, the producer. He had a lot to do with bringing sophistication to their music. He's the one that brought in the string quartets and the horn sections for their songs. And of course, when we're talking about those sorts of arrangements and instrumentation, we're talking about opening it up for many, many other possibilities, including turning those songs into jazz pieces. But it's obviously a tradition that's gone on for over a century now of jazz taking the pop music of the day and turning it into improvised arrangements and improvised songs. So that's what it's all about. And it's a great vehicle for a player to take a song that everybody knows and you just tell the audience and the listener, I'm going to take this tune and just wait till you hear it when it's done and tell me it's not jazz. I love it. It's something that has been done forever and hopefully, and I'm sure will be done forever.
But from your point of view, I mean, if you look back at a lot of the jazz recordings from especially the 50s and 60s, the producer was just as big a star as the artists that were performing. What about today? Does the producer still have on newer jazz recordings as an important role as, let's say, Norman Gans, for example, or others?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Keith. Some of the famous ones, even engineers who also had the function of being a producer. Rudy Van Gelder
Right.
Oversaw all those fantastic recordings right across the river from here in Manhattan, over in New Jersey at his awesome studio that so many of the most famous Prestige and Blue Note recordings of all time, he oversaw those things. So in essence, he was the producer, though he was really an engineer. Rudy Van Gelder worked with Creed Taylor, who was a producer and the owner of his record label, and they had a specific idea of the kind of things they wanted to do. And quite often they would have a rhythm section and then just bring in the leaders and rehearse the music, and they were in charge, and the leaders just listened to what the engineers and producers were telling them to do. Teo Macero, who did so many of Miles Davis's most famous works, Miles would go in and just play in a free manner, sometimes for over an hour, and then Teo Macero would sit down literally with a razor blade and cut those songs that have become so famous down to 25, 20, 18, 15-minute pieces, and that just doesn't happen anymore. To answer your question specifically, much more today, the artists themselves are being their own producer and director of their entire career, just as you and I are in charge of 100% of our productions and our programming. That's the way it is for artists these days, and I believe that the producer has a much less important place simply because of the numbers of artists that are taking their own careers by the horn and directing their own careers. It's partly because of economics. There aren't the big record labels that are out there that used to be in existence. There are just so few of them because of economics. They had to go out of business. Nobody was buying records and CDs anymore. They were getting their music through downloads, and they just aren't available. For example, there is on the island of Manhattan, where I live, only one huge record shop you can go to that has a massive jazz section. There is no other. no other record store in New York City where you can go and look over thousands of CDs to buy the music. It just doesn't exist. So no stores and no record companies to speak of, just very few. And the producers used to work for the record labels, and they brought in all the people on their roster and recorded them. Well, that just really doesn't exist anymore. So the answer to your question is producers are certainly not as important as they used to be. It's all on the shoulders of the artist himself or herself.
A few years ago, I watched a documentary on German television about Blue Note records and about the guys from Germany who went to the United States as immigrants and created Blue Note records. And the thing about Blue Note that always was, for me, I always thought was very special wasn't just the recording itself, but also the packaging. And they were
Yes.
interviewing some of the sound technicians and musicians that recorded uh, with the two guys, and they said, both of them were from Germany. They had no rhythm whatsoever. They would be in the studio, snapping their fingers and tapping their feet completely out of time to what was being played. But they said they knew exactly what they wanted.
Well, that's the worst kind of client to have. Someone who doesn't know what they want until they hear it. Uh, that's so interesting. That says a couple of things. They were businessmen, but they were open to artistic things, and as long as they didn't suppress the real desires of the artists, everything was going to be okay. And obviously, they did not. They gave them carte blanche to do what they felt like they wanted to do musically because they couldn't go in and alter it. They couldn't go in and make suggestions. They just had to sit and enjoy it. So
Well,
that's a great story.
one of the producers said that one of the funniest moments was Alfred Lyon getting on the talkback button, talking to the musicians with a very heavy German accent, telling them what he would like to hear, how he wants the feeling to come across. They just looked at each other and went, "Okay."
Well,
But they said there was the musicians that they spoke to said there was something about working with the two of them. They said that, like you just mentioned, they gave them the freedom to do what they want, but they also knew what they wanted to hear themselves because both of them were jazz fans.
Well, maybe they were trying to express a style they wanted to exhibit on Blue Note, just like the covers were going to be so sophisticated and so creative. They had a certain style in mind that they wanted the music to project, a certain style they wanted to have in Blue Note recordings. I can understand that to a certain extent. I mentioned Creed Taylor before. Creed Taylor was an A&M Records producer and decided he wanted to make jazz more popular. So he had a very specific idea of the style of recordings that he wanted to have on his label. And there wasn't going to be a broad spectrum of styles. It was going to be in a certain pocket. So he brought in Don Sebesky as his arranger, and he made sure that Wes Montgomery and Hubert Laws and George Benson and Freddie Hubbard, they all had a certain sort of sound and style to those recordings, and it helped keep jazz popular at a time when lots of folks thought it was sort of aimless in style. So I think the Alfred Lyons and etc. They had a specific idea of what the kind of sound they wanted, and for the most part, in the beginning especially, they had that small group acoustic sound that was going to happen, and it was very, very solid. And then they allowed others to develop, like soul jazz and modal jazz and free jazz, and all those other things evolved. But in the beginning, they had a very specific idea of the kind of sound they wanted. That's probably what he was saying over that speaker in the studio.
What about Chet Baker? And I bring this up because just 2 weeks ago, I have many vinyl discs. I don't even want to tell you how many I have. And I came across one that I totally forgot that I bought it in 1995. It was a reissue of Chet Baker playing with, of all things, a Herb Alpert-style mariachi band. I love Chet Baker, but it's like this stuff is 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 dreadful. And the description
Well,
on the album, it's odd because he was living in Europe when it was recorded.
right.
All the tracks were laid in Los Angeles. They sent the tracks to Europe where he laid down his flugelhorn. He wasn't even in the studio with the musicians, and he doesn't really play. He just plays little sections here and there. And I'm thinking, either he did this because he was using a lot of drugs at the time, or he needed the money.
Oh my goodness. Well, as my wife and I have told our daughter since she was old enough to understand what we were saying, everybody makes mistakes. So I think probably your instincts are probably correct, Keith. Chet Baker was certainly
Unpredictable.
uh, he was under the influence of a lot of very strong. He was an addicted person, and it's one of the sad things in jazz history. I've spoken to folks like Roy Haynes, the great drummer, who was there as a young guy in the heyday of bebop, and he played with Charlie Parker, and he played with Miles Davis, and he played with those other guys and Chet Baker, who were all under the influence of not only alcohol but heroin, and some of them never lived to be as old as they should have been because of that. It's pretty obvious, some of them. And he wouldn't even talk about it very much. He said it was just a scourge. So I'm afraid that Chet Baker was certainly, he had such a wonderful natural style. His musical spirit was so strong, but the rest of him was so weak. And he couldn't fight that addiction. And it's a tragedy.
He was also a great vocalist.
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. And it really came from his soul and his spirit. His unique style, too. The fact that he had that Oklahoma drawl and that sort of southern sensibility, but at the same time, that West Coast sophistication and people just loved his sound. It was so accessible and easy to listen to and take in and still at the same time adventurous. I mean, he was part of the cool jazz revolution and just a wonderful style of jazz that came from the West Coast. He and Jerry Mulligan together were just fantastic. And Chico Hamilton was a great drummer that worked with them. And I've known some other people that worked with him too, John Schofield and Dave Samuels and other modern musicians. And they said those guys were just a wreck. They made great music, but they were so addicted it was difficult to be around them.
Now, Jazz America airs around the world. Do you find a difference in the response that you get, let's say, from listeners overseas to a show that, let's say, you would do in the United States?
Well, yeah, I suppose so. I do believe there is a constant a thread that runs through all jazz fans. They resonate to that element in it that I've mentioned before, the freedom of the music. Some people just need their music very structured and in a certain specific style, and they're rigid in the way they want their music to be, no matter what the style may be. And I find that jazz fans all over the world, be they Americans or international, resonate to the freedom in the music and are much more open. But I will say that the international audience is more completely open, I think, than American audiences are, and more open to improvised and even freer styles of music. They can hear and take in more easily a more experimental or avant-garde style of jazz than Americans can. Americans seem to, and this is a generalization, please don't take it as an absolute. In a general sense, Americans are so used to a simpler arrangement, if you will, and more of a blues-based style of jazz and more structured form of jazz than the international audience, which loves the groove and the simple, funky blues and swing of traditional jazz, but they also like it avant-garde. So if I were going to separate the two, I would say that the international audience is more open to a freer style of jazz. And I think that can be proven to a certain extent by the number of American artists who make their living touring Asia and Europe as opposed to the United States, which is really more of a pop and rock audience, and the numbers of jazz fans is lower than the pop and rock fans, whereas internationally it's more, I'll put under the huge umbrella of simply music fans. I think that the international audience, from what I can tell, could listen to a classical music concert in a traditional way, or a jazz concert, or a hip hop concert, or a techno concert, and be just as happy. They wouldn't even differentiate. It's just music, whereas Americans may be a little bit more, shall I say, prejudiced with the kind of music they personally like, and they don't want to expand their horizons as much as the international audience does.
Do you think also part of that could be that in many of these countries, if we take, let's say, Eastern Europe, where, during the Cold War, jazz was illegal and banned in many Eastern European countries and in other parts of the world, do you think that may have a part in it?
Yes, I think so. Obviously, with Willis Conover, that was the main thrust of his presentation, and that was the audience that he reached more directly than any other audience in the world. The Eastern European audience was hungry for the freedom of jazz, and he really served it up to them. Now, with Eastern Europe, it's developed. They have their own jazz radio stations everywhere. It's not that foreign thing that is almost unattainable. Now it's easily attainable, and instead, VOA's Jazz America, which I present, not only goes by shortwave and internet, but also we present it to and offer it to radio stations all around the world to accept. If they have a satellite dish, they can take in the feed and rebroadcast it anytime they like. And that is what happens with a lot of Eastern European radio stations in countries not only there but around the world. Now, those that listen on shortwave, the ones that don't have that infrastructure that more developed countries in Europe and other parts of the world have, they still listen, and that audience is responding to me, I think, like the Eastern European audience used to respond to Willis. For example, a large portion of my email communication comes from Africa. African countries don't have the infrastructure quite often that other countries do, and so they're still picking it up on shortwave, and those are the folks that are my Eastern Europe, if you will. So it's an interesting thing that's happened down through the years.
Russ Davis from Jazz America, thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Keith, it's been my great, great pleasure, and the only problem I've had here is that your voice is so infinitely more resonant and perfect than mine. I'm jealous. So you have a great presentation, I can tell, and thanks for having me on your program. It really was a joy.